The end of the Napoleonic era marked the rise of Louis XVIII and the restoration of a true monarchy in France. However, like the rest of Europe, this era marks an age of turmoil. During the period between 1815 and 1850, economics and politics become the driving source of change within France.
The economic state of France from 1815 to 1850 was not very stable. Tariffs rose steadily after 1816, so high sometimes that items became totally excluded. So the supporters of the high tariffs were French farmers, French farm producers, large landowners, and businessmen. The protective system kept France domestic prices high and was a cause of the slowed modernization. France experienced an economic crisis in 1826, which led to much unrest with the people and also helped cause the Revolution of 1813, which sent Charles X out of the throne. Which turned the role from Bourbon to Orleans. The economy under Louis Philippe wasn't very stable either. He spent more money than did the Bourbons, and he continued the high tariffs in favor of the business class as he was the bourgeoisie king. He spent a lot of money for railways and in schools, and put money towards the army and agricultural developments and roads, and the debt of France continued to rise because their imports rose about twice as much and the exports only rose half as much as they had before. There was a business crisis in 1846 until 1851. The Bank of France wasn't good at mobilizing capital, and the Bank of France was still pretty new as it was established in 1800. The joint stock type credit institutions were formed so people could become a part of the railways even if they didn't have enough money. And the banks were very stingy about who they loaned money to because they would only loan money to those who were sure to pay back the loans. The crisis occurred because of crop failures. The food prices rose, railway companies went bankrupt, factory production went down, and the tariffs still remained very high. And many people, in order to solve these problems, immigrated out of France. And that was the most massive exodus, as I think 250,000 people left France. The Industrial Revolution in France wasn't as important as that of England and wasn't that as progressive until about Napoleon III's reign. It wasn't as developed as England's, one because fuel was so expensive, and France had the highest population of any other country in Europe at that time. So with fuel costs being so high and them having so many workers available, they didn't need machines, so they didn't work at developing mechanics. And the economic idea was that security is better than expansion, and it's better to be safe than sorry, so they didn't take risks and they didn't invest, and it was seen as cruel and unkind to try and destroy a competitor's business, and that harsh idea of business was new and not very accepted at that time. The real progress didn't come until Louis Napoleon's reign after 1850.
When the anti-Napoleonic forces finally defeated Napoleon and ended the 100 Days, they set about setting up a permanent restoration government. Upon suggestion from Talleyrand, a prominent French politician, they installed Louis XVIII on the throne. As a ruler, he was considered considerably more conservative than Napoleon, and invited many of the émigrés to return to their previous lives. A type of representative council was also formed to represent the interests of the French people. However, in the spirit of conservatism, it was extremely limited and only the most monetary elite individuals could join. Two factions vied for dominance in this council. One was the liberal interests that typically came from the bourgeois merchants. The other interest was the ultra-conservatives, who sought to restore the legacy of absolute monarchs. During the reign of Louis XVIII, neither faction was dominant, and the general policy of this time was considered to be fairly moderate. However, with the succession of Charles X to the throne, things changed dramatically. The ultra-royalists seized control of council with key royal appointments. They began to slowly shift power, which had been growing towards the bourgeois, back to the nobility. They also took the first steps in restoring noble properties that had been lost when the post-revolutionary government sold them to fund the French war effort. Louis X's conservative reforms culminated in the July Ordinance of 1830. They had been masterminded by Jules Armand de Polignac, his chief minister and a former emigre. These reforms sought to bring Louis's regime back to an almost absolutist status. They included severely receding the influence of the representative council and eliminating the bourgeois from it almost entirely, while at the same time muzzling the press. The audacity of such a decree outraged people into revolt. Within 3 days, the king had abdicated in favor of a new ruler, Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe, also called the Citizen King, had a relatively peaceful reign. He was an ardent supporter of the wealthy middle-class bourgeois. As time progressed, his policies grew more and more monarchical. All the while, the economic gaps began to widen between the upper bourgeois and the lower class, and artisan population. Ultimately, another popular insurrection arose, causing Louis Philippe to abdicate his throne in 1848. The new government became known in France as the Second Republic, and was the most liberal of this time period. It would not fall until well after the 18th. This graph illustrates the relationship between economic prosperity, politics, time, and social class. The economic prosperity for each time period is in large part dictated by the political leadership of the time. For example, during the reign of Louis XVIII, both the bourgeois and royalists prospered. The royalists had a much larger economic gain because the restoration of the monarchy had just been completed. During the second period, with the rise of the ultra-conservative Charles X, both bourgeois and artisan economics declined. In this case, the economic changes dictated a change in regime with the July Revolution. Now Louis Philippe came to power. During his period, we see a sharp decline in the nobility because of his popular election, but we also see a growing disparity between the artisans and the upper bourgeois. This discrepancy is again going to dictate another revolution and the establishment of the Second Republic. An important thing to remember during this time is the prosperity of the working class remained relatively unchanged, no matter which regime was in power. Many of the developments in French society also relate to how economics and politics played out. Militarily, France had been severely minimized as a result of Napoleon's conquest of Europe and the subsequent settlement after the Battle of Waterloo. Some of the most impactful military actions took place during the 3 days of the July Revolution. One of the factors contributing to this revolution, which is rarely noted, is progressively expansionist policy. France during this period was in the throes of a military conflict with the Algerian people. Most of Charles X's military actions took the form of sending troops to retain power in overseas countries. The development of social and political action during this period played a key role in influencing Karl Marx, who immigrated there after being kicked out of Germany and Prussia. It was in Paris that Marx and Engels made their lasting relationship that would influence the course of human history. Marx, being the popular writer he was also kicked out of Paris. However, his years in France would play a key role in the development of the Communist Manifesto. To summarize, France experienced dynamic change. It shifted from stages where the nobility and strong monarchy was favored to times when the bourgeois and representative government had more power. These political changes had economic implications, and whenever the economic model shifted towards any one group, noble, bourgeois, or artisan, a revolution developed, usually creating political change. Likewise, we see that other aspects of French society being severely influenced by these implications. The military played an important role in both causing this change directly and causing unrest with which to spur further change. The swirlings of French society also became the inspiration of many intellectual works, the most influential of which has been the Communist Manifesto. All of these developments of themselves are key examples of the ever-changing French climate. These events would be influential in what role France would play in the coming century.